So imagine a system of inequality that is so perfectly engineered that it doesn't even need a dictator to enforce it.
Right.
Like it doesn't need standing armies, it doesn't need secret police. Instead, it just relies on, your neighbor, your religious texts, and even your own biological sense of disgust to keep you exactly where you were born.
It's incredible when you think about it that way.
It really is. And today, we are opening up a massive stack of research, historical archives, sociological frameworks. We're doing a deep dive into the history and the lived reality of the Dalit experience in South Asia.
And looking at these materials, what stands out immediately, and I mean right off the bat, is that we aren't just looking at some historical anomaly or, a regional quirk.
Yeah.
We're looking at the raw underlying mechanics of human hierarchy, how human beings build invisible walls between each other, and, more importantly, how they convince themselves those walls are entirely natural.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this deep dive because our mission today, for everyone listening, isn't just to recite a timeline. We aren't going to just read off a list of ancient dynasties or barrage you with dates.
No, that wouldn't be very helpful.
Exactly. Instead, we are going to reverse engineer a 3,000-year-old social system. We really want to look at the machinery of how a society categorizes people, how prejudice is structurally manufactured, literally century by century, and ultimately, how a marginalized group reclaims its identity from the inside out.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is. But for you listening, whether you're trying to understand global history or, maybe you're a manager navigating modern corporate hierarchies or just someone fascinated by human psychology, this is an absolute masterclass in social engineering and resilience.
It really is. But to do that effectively, we have to establish a clear baseline. We need to clear away the biggest misconception right at the top.
Right, let's get into that.
The sources are adamant about this. Dalit is not a single static group across time. It's not just one monolith.
It's much more fluid than that.
Exactly. It is a dynamic category. It's a position within a much larger, constantly evolving caste system. Over different eras, this category encompasses thousands of different subgroups, regional identities, lived experiences.
So we are talking about a layered, incredibly complex system.
Yes, one that continuously produces marginalized groups based on a very specific triad. And that triad is function, belief, and inheritance.
Function, belief, and inheritance. I want to pin those three concepts to the board because before we can understand the why of this system, we really must map out the how.
Right, the actual mechanics.
Yeah, how does the society actually build this? Because looking at the historical archives in front of us, societies don't just wake up on a Tuesday with an inescapable, rigid hierarchy.
No, it takes a lot of time.
It took millennia of continuous reinforcement, didn't it?
It did. Let's trace those early roots in the source material. We usually start in what's broadly categorized as the Vedic period, so roughly 1500 to 500 BCE.
Okay, so we're going way back.
Way back. This is a time of massive transition. You have semi-nomadic pastoral groups who are finally settling down into agrarian societies. And as society becomes more complex, it organizes into the Varna system.
The Varna system, right.
Yeah, these are broad functional classes. They're often described metaphorically in early texts as parts of a cosmic body.
Like a literal human body.
Exactly. You have the Brahmins, the priests and scholars, as the head. Then the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, they're the arms. The Vaishyas, the traders and agriculturalists, make up the thighs. And the Shudras, the laborers, are the feet.
Okay, so I'm scanning this breakdown of the Varna system in our notes, and I'm realizing something. The people we are focusing on today, the Proto-Dalit subgroups, they aren't the feet.
No, they are not.
They aren't even in the metaphor of the body at all.
They are completely omitted from that cosmic architecture. The sources refer to them as avarna, which literally translates to outside the Varna.
Wow. Which really begs the question, how do you get pushed completely outside the body of society?
It's a great question.
The documents suggest it came down to the absolute physical reality of early city building. I mean, we're talking about the basic division of labor.
Right. The stuff someone just has to do.
Exactly. Someone has to handle the burial. Someone has to process the carcasses of dead cattle for leather. Someone has to manage human waste so the settlement doesn't, succumb to cholera.
And these are tasks that are biologically non-negotiable. Any sedentary society needs this to survive. But a critical shift begins to happen here.
What kind of shift?
Well, the society takes these absolutely necessary occupations and begins to associate them with ritual impurity. The labor is essential, sure, but the laborer themselves become stigmatized.
We'll dig deeply into the psychology of that shift in a moment because it's fascinating.
Mhm.
But let's follow the historical thread first.
Let's do it.
So we move from the Vedic into the classical and post-Vedic period. This stretches from about 500 BCE to 1200 CE. And the texts show those broad, somewhat flexible Varna categories hardening into the jati system.
Right, and jati fundamentally translates to birth.
Okay, so birth, meaning you're locked in.
Completely. The flexibility of the early agrarian world vanishes. These are no longer just occupational categories you might kind of fall into. They are birth-based, closed groups.
So if you are born into a family of weavers, you are a weaver.
Exactly. If you're born into a family of leather workers, you are a leather worker, period. And the concept of untouchability begins to take a very concrete physical form during this stretch.
Even if the modern vocabulary for it comes much later, right?
Yeah, the terminology evolves. But the overarching development here is that the binary of purity versus impurity becomes the absolute center of gravity for the entire social order.
So it shifts from just a job description to a state of being. And the spatial geography of the village actually changes to reflect this.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. It's mapped onto the physical world.
The source notes detail how these groups are literally pushed to the physical margins.
Mm-hmm.
You see the creation of separate hamlets like the Dalit Wada or the Sheri.
Always located outside the main village boundaries.
Always. Usually downstream, usually downwind. It's essentially an architectural expulsion.
And this physical segregation is enforced because your very presence, at least according to this hardening ideological code, is viewed as a threat.
A threat to what exactly?
A threat to the spiritual and physical purity of the dominant groups. Like, you cannot draw water from the same, well, because water transmits pollution. We cannot enter the temple. The separation becomes absolute.
That's intense. And then I'm looking at the transition into the medieval period, roughly 1200 to 1700 CE. You have massive political upheaval across the board.
Huge changes.
Yeah, large parts of South Asia are incorporated into various Islamic empires. You have
Yeah.
new rulers, new religions, entirely new courts. But the caste system, remarkably, doesn't break.
It doesn't. The imperial canopy changes, right?
Yeah.
But the roots remain completely untouched. Islamic rulers and later other regional powers, they were generally pragmatic.
Pragmatic meaning they just wanted to keep things running.
Exactly. They needed to collect taxes, they needed to maintain order, and to do that, they relied on local village administrators and landlords, who were invariably from the dominant castes.
So the village-level power dynamics were just preserved in amber.
Pretty much. Now, the sources explicitly note that during this era, many marginalized groups converted to Islam, or later to Sikhism or Christianity.
Looking for an out, seeking an egalitarian escape hatch.
Exactly. But it didn't really work as an escape hatch, did it?
No, it didn't. The social stigma just followed them into the new religion, which really proves we aren't just looking at a theological rulebook here. We're looking at a cultural operating system that runs way deeper than any single religion's text.
That's a great way to put it.
And then you have the British East India Company and eventually the British Crown arriving, the colonial period spanning 1700 to 1947.
This is a massive structural inflection point in the source material. The British arrive with an empire-building mindset.
They want to measure everything.
Exactly. They are administrators entirely obsessed with classification, measurement, and order. They looked at the staggering complexity of thousands of fluid regional jatis and basically found it impossible to govern or tax efficiently.
Too messy for them.
Way too messy. So they initiated massive, sweeping census projects, most notably starting in the late 19th century.
I'm looking at the accounts of those colonial census takers in our notes. They were going village to village, essentially forcing people to pick a definitive rank.
Yes.
And I'm struggling with the mechanics here. Taking a messy living ecosystem of thousands of localized hierarchies and forcing it into a rigid imperial spreadsheet. Did the British actually invent this specific flavor of prejudice? Or did they just bureaucratize it?
The sources are really nuanced here, and we have to be precise. The British absolutely did not invent the caste system or the concept of untouchability.
Okay, so it was already there.
Oh, definitely. The hierarchies, the brutal segregation, the framework of purity and pollution, those existed for centuries before a British ship ever landed.
Right.
However, by systemizing it, they froze it. The colonial census required everyone to be placed in a fixed hierarchical list.
So you had to have a label.
You had to have a label. They introduced broad administrative umbrellas, eventually settling on the term scheduled castes in the 1930s. So a fluid, highly localized, albeit deeply unequal social reality became a rigid, legal, continent-wide definition.
So if I'm reading this right, they took cultural prejudice and weaponized it for administrative paperwork.
That's exactly what happened.
Though the archives also point out this colonial era inadvertently introduced new variables.
Yeah.
You had the expansion of railways, where people are suddenly crammed into train cars regardless of caste.
Right. Physical proximity you couldn't avoid.
Yeah, and you have missionary schools offering education to marginalized groups for the first time. You even have the emergence of formal, organized anti-caste movements.
Which perfectly brings us to the threshold of modern India, from 1947 to the present. The newly independent nation drafts its constitution.
Led largely by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is a brilliant scholar, a jurist, and Dalit himself. Yes. And the very first major swing is Article 17, the legal, constitutional abolition of untouchability.
It is a monumental legal achievement. This is also the era where the specific identity of Dalit is galvanized.
How so?
Well, it becomes a self-chosen, deeply political identity. It translates from Marathi and Sanskrit roots to mean broken or scattered, but it is reclaimed with immense pride and militancy. It becomes a unifying banner for thousands of disparate Jautis.
But the heavy reality hanging over these modern sources, and I think anyone listening can relate to this on some level with modern institutions, is that passing a law does not magically rewrite 3,000 years of cultural conditioning.
No, it absolutely does not.
Legal equality did not and has not equated to social equality. The deep ruts of the system, the marriage networks, the rural segregation, the economic disparities, they endure.
Because the overarching pattern we've just traced is terrifyingly resilient. It operates in a very clear sequence.
Break that sequence down for us.
Okay, so first, an occupation is assigned based on societal need. Then, that occupation becomes labeled as ritually impure. Right.
Next, that impurity is declared hereditary. Then, that hereditary role envelops the person's entire social identity. And finally, that identity is justified by grand ideological frameworks. It becomes a self-replicating machine.
Let's pop the hood on that machine for a second. I want to look at the trigger layer, the material origins of this stigma.
Let's do it.
Because I am staring at this massive timeline, and there is a glaring absence here. There is no single war. There is no massive invasion event documented here where one dominant ethnic group conquers another, enslaves them, and declares them untouchable.
Right, it's not a conqueror versus conquered narrative.
Exactly. So if it wasn't that dynamic, what was the initial spark?
The spark is startlingly mundane, which is honestly what makes it so unsettling. It begins with the fundamental division of labor in early human settlements.
Just the daily grind of keeping a town running.
Yeah. As we discussed, sedentary societies require waste management. They require the disposal of human and animal remains. If a cow dies in the center of a dense village, someone has to physically move a 1,000-pound rotting carcass. Right, and someone has to process that skin into leather.
Exactly. It's the physical reality of survival. The jobs that guarantee the society won't collapse under its own refuse.
But that nobody actually wants to do because it's physically grueling and deeply unpleasant.
At this nascent stage, the division of labor was likely functional. It wasn't driven by deep-seated hatred or complex theology. It was an immediate material need.
Just, we need a guy to do this.
Right. But then it moves from a material condition to a perceived threat. Handling death, blood, and human waste carries very real, very severe biological disease risks. Early societies intuitively understood this risk, even without germ theory.
I mean, I understand the instinct to isolate disease risk. You want the waste management downstream, right? But I am really struggling with the leap in logic here.
The leap to impurity.
Yeah, I understand needing someone to handle sanitation. But jumping from you have a dirty job to you, your children, and your children's children are biologically and spiritually impure for eternity, that defies basic logic. How on earth did they sell that to the general public?
They sold it through the psychological mechanism of contamination. The real physical risk of disease slowly morphed into a powerful symbolic fear of spiritual pollution.
So the disease becomes a metaphor.
Exactly. The association shifts entirely. The logic goes from these people are around dangerous, unclean things to these people are the dangerous, unclean thing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the individual becomes completely fused with their function.
And once you fuse the person to the pollution, you get what the sociological frameworks in our sources call identity boundary formation.
Yes. Because human groups inherently define themselves by contrast. We understand who we are by defining who we are not.
Right, the classic in-group versus out-group dynamic.
Exactly. As these early societies became more stratified and complex, dominant groups sought to define themselves as pure, elevated, and refined. But purity is a relative concept. You cannot be pure unless someone else is impure.
So they needed a foot.
They did. The proto-Dalit groups became the necessary other. They were the sociological anchor that allowed the rest of the hierarchy to feel secure in its own status.
So they basically subsidized the comfort of the entire civilization.
That's exactly what they did.
By keeping one specific group locked at the absolute bottom, permanently tasked with the undesirable labor, the dominant groups guarantee they would never have to do it themselves. It stabilized the resource distribution.
And notice how the system creates the profound difference after the fact, not before.
What do you mean by that?
Initially, these groups shared the same broader cultural and linguistic space. But by excluding them from full participation, barring them from education, and physically isolating them over centuries, the dominant system manufactured the very differences it later used to justify the exclusion.
It's as if a society didn't start out looking for a scapegoat. They started out looking for a janitor.
Right.
And over generations, they convinced themselves that the janitor was literally a biologically different species just to justify never letting them out of the basement.
That captures the transition perfectly. The system locked in an external functional role, mutated it into an internal, inescapable identity, and built a permanent ceiling over it.
Wow.
It is the classic sociological shift from a necessary role to an inherently inferior people.
But how do you actually enforce that internally? I mean, moving into the narrative and psychological machinery, how does a society convince everyday, otherwise decent, rational people to treat a necessary worker as a permanent outcast?
It takes work.
Yeah, you can't just mandate that with a royal decree. A law requires enforcement, but a belief enforces itself. You need a narrative.
You absolutely need a narrative. And you need a narrative that entirely bypasses the rational brain and goes straight to the emotional core.
Okay, so what was the core emotion?
The narrative this system anchored on was the concept of the impure, and the primary emotional trigger for impurity is disgust.
Disgust, not anger, not even necessarily fear in the beginning, just disgust.
Disgust is arguably the most potent tool for social exclusion in human psychology, because it feels biological.
Right, it doesn't feel like an idea.
Exactly. It doesn't feel like a political ideology you were taught. It feels like an obvious, involuntary physical truth. Think about the evolutionary purpose of disgust. It is a pathogen avoidance mechanism.
It keeps you from eating poison.
Yes. It makes you recoil from a rotting carcass or spoiled food to save your life. What the caste system did was hijack that evolutionary survival mechanism and apply it to a group of human beings.
Think about that for a second in your own life if you're listening. When you feel disgusted by something like a terrible smell or mold on your food, you don't pause to debate the logic of it.
You don't rationalize it.
No. You don't write a pros and cons list about whether you should eat the mold. Your body just reacts. Your stomach turns. You just pull away. By hardwiring the concept of disgust into the culture, the architects of this system bypass critical thinking completely.
They absolutely did.
When a dominant caste person was taught from infancy that contact with the Dalit person would literally contaminate them, they experienced that as a bodily reality.
And once disgust is successfully weaponized, it paves the way for the next narrative shift. The story evolves from they do this work to they are naturally suited for this work because they are inherently inferior.
So disgust morphs into contempt.
Disgust morphs into contempt mixed with a profound sense of superiority. And then you get the final layer of the narrative. They are socially out of place.
What does that mean in practice?
The idea that elevating them or allowing them to change professions would violate the cosmic or social balance, this triggers the fear of disorder.
I'm looking at how perfectly this myth-making aligns with the system's needs. It's almost too neat. Society needs to avoid doing this terrible labor. The narrative says they are naturally suited for it.
Right.
Society needs to maintain physical distance to hoard resources. The narrative says they are impure and contagious. Society needs to prevent them from moving up and competing for elite roles. The narrative says They lack the intellectual capacity.
It's incredibly convenient.
Society needs to preserve the entire hierarchy without guilt. The narrative says, cosmic order must be maintained. It is a highly functional mythology.
It creates a fascinating psychological split in the dominant population. Disgust and the fear of disorder intensify prejudice to the point where systemic exclusion feels like maintaining harmony.
Like you're doing a good thing.
Exactly. It feels like maintaining order, not committing harm. This is a softer but incredibly insidious form of dehumanization.
Right, because you don't need violent rhetoric.
You don't need exterminationist rhetoric at all. Nobody has to stand in the village square and give a speech saying we must destroy these people. It just requires a quiet, collective agreement that someone is polluting. It turns the necessity of their labor into the mark of their inferiority.
So the narrative is built on disgust, contempt, and the fear of disorder. But ideas evaporate over centuries unless you build structures to house them. A story is just a story until you make it the architecture of daily life. How did this belief actually become physical reality?
This is where the ideology becomes concrete. The primary structural reinforcement was spatial and social segregation. We briefly touched on the Dalit Wada, the separate living areas.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about living a few streets over. It was a complete severing of communal resources. We are talking about strict bans on accessing the main village wells.
Which, in a pre-industrial agrarian society, is literally a matter of life and death.
Absolutely. Bans on entering temples, which were the centers of social and economic life, not just religious life. Bans on accessing local schooling or learning Sanskrit.
A total quarantine of opportunity.
Combined with the ultimate tool of social control, strict endogamy.
This is a huge point in the source material. If you control marriage, you control the entire system. Endogamy ensures that you can only ever marry someone within your specific narrow jati.
Because if marriage across caste lines is permitted, wealth, property, and status begin to leak out of the dominant groups.
Right, the borders get fuzzy.
Exactly. Bloodlines mix, and the rigid boundaries of tyranny completely collapse. By violently enforcing endogamy, you lock the system. There is no exit, which means there is no disruption. Your occupation is hereditary, your living space is segregated, and your marriage prospects are totally contained.
The physical and social architecture makes social mobility literally impossible.
Impossible by design.
But again, people generally don't want to feel like they're the villains of their own story.
Yeah.
If you are a dominant caste landowner sitting comfortably at the top of this architecture, looking at the crushing poverty and exclusion of the people doing your hardest labor just outside the village, you need a philosophical framework to help you sleep at night.
You definitely do.
You need something that tells you this is actually the way the universe wants it.
You require a justification layer, and the frameworks developed here are remarkably potent. First, you have the weaponization of karma-based logic.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
The theological concept of karma action and reaction was interpreted by those in power in a very specific, convenient way. The logic dictates your birth in this life is the direct result of your actions in a previous life.
Okay.
Therefore, if you are born into a marginalized suffering group, it is not the fault of the society, it is the fault of your own past soul. You deserve it.
That is a staggering psychological maneuver. It completely absolves the present system of any moral responsibility. You don't have to feel an ounce of guilt about exploiting someone because you are just facilitating cosmic justice.
Exactly. It resolves all moral discomfort. And then you combine that with the concept of dharma, often translated as duty or cosmic order.
Right.
The prevailing ideology dictated that everyone has a specific ordained role to play to maintain the balance of the universe.
Oh.
If a marginalized person attempts to break the hierarchy, say by seeking education or refusing traditional labor, they aren't just breaking a local law.
They are committing a sin against the cosmos.
Yes, they are causing universal chaos.
The sources also point out a heavy reliance on a sort of proto-scientific essentialism, the assignment of fixed, unchangeable traits to specific groups.
Like biological determinism.
Yeah, the assumption that they are physically built for dirty work and they simply lack the refinement for intellectual or administrative work.
Which leads to what sociologists identify as the false cause and effect loop. This is arguably the most brilliant and devastating mechanism in the entire architecture.
Break that down for us.
The dominant system creates a horrific condition and then points to that very condition as proof that the system is correct.
I want to make sure I'm getting this right because this loop seems to be the engine of the whole thing.
Huh.
The logic operates entirely backward.
Completely backward.
The dominant society looks at the Dalit communities and says, they live in crushing poverty, therefore they are inherently inferior. Or, they do unclean work, therefore they are inherently unclean, or they don't read the sacred texts, therefore they lack intellectual ability.
When the reality is completely inverted, the system forced them into economic destitution. The system violently assigned them the unclean work. The system banned them from reading or accessing schools under threat of severe punishment.
Right.
And then, having engineered those exact outcomes, the system points to the result and says, see, we were right about them all along. Thank goodness we have this hierarchy.
Wow. It is a perfectly sealed, impenetrable loop.
It is an airtight mechanism for psychological self-protection.
But looking at this from the outside, I think a lot of modern listeners might be thinking, if this system is this oppressive, this rigged, why not just refuse to participate?
Right, why not just leave?
Yeah. Why did the marginalized groups just collectively say, we aren't doing this anymore, we are leaving the village?
That brings us to the constraint layer and the crushing economic realities of the agrarian world. We have to look at the immense cost of non-participation.
Because it wasn't just a fine or a slap on the wrist.
Far from it. The system didn't just exist in abstract theological debates or a distant king's palace. It lived in the dirt of the village square. It lived in the Jajmani system, the network of hereditary economic obligations that govern village life.
So the village economy was basically a closed circuit.
Precisely. The dominant castes owned the land, they controlled the grain, they controlled the water sources. For a Dalit individual or family, the cost of resistance was existential.
Meaning life or death.
Open defiance didn't just mean a fine, it meant a total social and economic boycott. If you refused your assigned degrading labor, the landowners wouldn't sell you grain. You couldn't access the land to graze an animal, you couldn't draw water.
So you starve.
It meant absolute starvation and severe, often lethal physical retaliation. The system made daily, literal survival completely dependent on compliance.
Which perfectly transitions us into looking at the people maintaining this, who actually keeps this massive 3,000-year-old machine running. Because we love to look at historical injustices and imagine a small, dark room full of cartoonish villains pulling the strings.
Right, the evil mastermind theory.
Yeah. But the data reveals something much more uncomfortable about human nature.
A system this vast, this enduring, cannot be sustained by a handful of villains. It requires the active and passive participation of millions of people, each with different motivations whose actions align to reinforce the hierarchy.
Let's break down the primary actors in the sources. First, you have the religious authorities, the scholars, the interpreters of texts.
They served as the legitimizers. They interpreted and transmitted the complex ideas about purity, impurity, karma, and cosmic order. Now, many of them didn't necessarily wake up deciding to consciously invent oppression.
So they actually believed it.
They were often what we might call the true believers. They were driven by a deep desire for theological meaning, ritual purity, and cosmic stability. They provided the philosophical scaffolding that made the oppression seem divine.
Then you have the rulers, the kings, the local chieftains, and eventually the colonial administrators.
They were the pragmatists. Their primary, overwhelming goal was maintaining governance, maximizing tax revenue, and avoiding peasant revolts.
They just wanted a quiet kingdom.
Exactly. For a ruler, a stable, rigidly enforced social hierarchy means easier rule. They rarely had any interest in dismantling the caste system. They simply worked within it. They didn't need to actively create the prejudice. They just needed to enforce the stability it provided.
But the sources emphasize that the most crucial group, the actual engine of the system, were the dominant castes and the everyday citizens. The landowning peasants, the merchants, the artisans.
Middle layers.
Yes, they are the daily enforcers. They are the ones guarding the village well and enforcing the spatial boundaries, and their motivations are fascinatingly diverse.
This is where the psychology of prejudice becomes very granular. Among everyday citizens, you certainly have the internalized believers who genuinely accept the hierarchy as biological fact. But much more importantly, you have the status protectors.
I really want to highlight this because it explains so much of human history. The idea that even non-elite groups, people who are themselves quite low on the overall ladder, who have no real wealth or power, will fiercely, violently defend the system simply because it guarantees there is someone officially below them.
It provides immense psychological comfort. The middle layers of any society will furiously defend the hierarchy to protect their relative status. If the bottom falls out, their own marginal superiority vanishes.
That makes a lot of sense, sadly.
Then, alongside them, you have the fearful followers. These are people who go along with the brutal rules of the system simply because they fear the social consequences of breaking them.
So they might not even agree with it.
They aren't zealots. But if they share food with a Dalit neighbor, they themselves will face boycott and excommunication from their own caste. They are driven by the fear of losing their community.
And finally, the economic dependence, the passive participants, people whose lives are just materially easier because the system exists.
Right.
They rely on the cheap, captive labor for sanitation, agriculture, and maintenance. They might not actively participate in boycott. They might even consider themselves kind. But their daily comfort depends entirely on the system continuing undisturbed. They are driven by habit and convenience.
This forces us to ask, who really sustains prejudice? It is sustained by the true believer writing the texts, the pragmatist collecting the taxes, the status protector guarding the well, the fearful follower looking the other way, and the passive participant enjoying the clean streets.
It reminds me of how a highly toxic corporate culture survives today.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
You don't need a cartoon villain CEO.
Yeah.
You might have a zealous CEO at the top, but that toxic culture only breathes because the middle managers, the status protectors, and the junior employees, the fearful followers, keep enforcing the unwritten, abusive rules just to protect their own promotions and avoid drawing fire. The system survives because the vast majority of people just find it easier to continue it.
It is the ultimate tragedy of sociology. Ordinary human tendencies, the desire for status, convenience, community belonging, and moral certainty, are arranged into an architecture that produces profound inhumanity.
But human beings aren't programmable robots. You can build the most airtight psychological and physical architecture in history, but eventually the pressure builds. People push back. What happens when the people at the bottom of this machinery finally resist? Does the system break, or does it learn?
That is a critical question, and the historical record is complex. First, we have to acknowledge why widespread, unified resistance was difficult for centuries.
Right.
It goes back to the fragmentation. We aren't talking about one unified Dalit class, historically. We are talking about thousands of highly localized, distinct Jatis speaking different languages scattered across the subcontinent.
So it's hard to organize.
Very hard. This extreme fragmentation prevented a single, unified opposition identity from forming early on. The system's sheer complexity protected it.
But there was resistance. The archives are full of localized clashes, groups asserting their rights to use a road, or adopting the dress of dominant castes, or joining egalitarian movements like the Bhakti movement.
Absolutely. But here we encounter the terrifying paradox of the system, the amplification effect.
The amplification effect.
Yes. When localized reactive resistance or conflict occurs, when a marginalized group pushes against the boundaries, the dominant narrative doesn't pause and self-reflect. It weaponizes that resistance.
How does that work in practice? Like on the ground?
Well, the dominant groups point to the conflict. They point to the marginalized group asserting their basic rights, and they reframe it entirely. They say to the rest of society, look, see how dangerous they are, see how aggressive they are disrupting the peace of the village, they don't know their place. This is exactly why we need these strict rules.
Oh, wow. So a small-scale push for basic human dignity gets magnified into a moral panic about societal collapse.
Precisely. It becomes a deeply cynical confirmation bias loop. The dominant group uses the resistance as the ultimate justification for even stricter control, reinforcing the stereotype that the marginalized group is inherently chaotic and needs to be managed.
That's incredibly twisted.
The system actually depends on occasional conflict to prove to the middle layers of society why the rigid hierarchy is absolutely necessary for their safety.
It's like someone is trapped in a tiny, suffocating box for their entire life. And when they finally start pounding on the walls just to get a breath of air, the people standing comfortably outside the box don't ask, why did we put a human being in a box?
Exactly.
They point to the pounding and say, look how violently they are acting. Thank God we put them in that box. Add another lock.
That analogy perfectly captures the asymmetry of power. The dominant system's violence is structural, continuous, quiet, and normalized. It's just the way things are.
Yeah.
But the resistance is often localized, loud, reactive, and constrained. The dominant group uses the availability bias of human psychology, taking one vivid, loud example of conflict, to justify the entire, quiet, overarching violence of the system.
It's incredibly dark, but mechanically it's brilliant. However, we cannot leave the story there. because this isn't ancient history and the system did not win permanently.
No, it didn't.
We have to map how this massive machine operates in the present day and how people are actively dismantling it. Let's move into the modern legacy and the era of reclamation.
This is where the narrative shifts from a historical autopsy to a living, evolving reality. And to understand the present, we must start by clearing away the modern misconceptions that still cloud this topic.
Right. Misconception number one, Dalits are just passive victims of history, waiting to be saved.
The historical reality is a long, robust tradition of intellectual movements, cultural resistance, and profound political leadership. We briefly mentioned Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
The architect of the Constitution.
Yes, he wasn't just a figurehead. He was a brilliant economist, jurist, and social reformer who held doctorates from Columbia University and the London School of Economics. He fundamentally challenged the moral foundations of caste.
He didn't just accept the narrative.
Not at all. He debated fiercely with figures like Gandhi over the approach to emancipation and became the chief architect of the Indian Constitution. And he is just one in a long lineage of thinkers, poets, and leaders proving that marginalized groups have always been active agents navigating and fighting these constraints.
Misconception number two. This is purely a Hindu theological issue.
Reality. Caste-based discrimination, while originating and deeply codified in that specific historical context, persists across almost all religions in South Asia.
So it crossed over.
Oh, completely. You see clear caste-like dynamics, segregation, and endogamy in South Asian Islam, Christianity, and Sikhism. It proves that caste is a deeply embedded regional social system, a cultural contagion, not just a set of religious rules.
Misconception number three. Discrimination is over because it's illegal now.
Reality. The practice of untouchability is legally abolished, but it remains socially, culturally, and economically persistent. It still heavily dictates marriage patterns, social networks, and access to capital, particularly in rural life, but also in urban centers. Systems can be entirely illegal, but still culturally alive.
And this brings us to what the sociological notes call the Tommy translation archetype.
Yes.
This is a framework for understanding the core internal conflict of the modern Dalit experience. Let me ground this in a composite example from the modern case studies in our sources. Imagine a brilliant young engineering student from a Dalit background today. They make it into a premier tech institute. They are coding alongside dominant caste peers, but they constantly hide their last name.
Because in South Asia, your last name immediately signals your caste.
Exactly. They're navigating the tension between their internal reality and the external narrative. Internally, they know their capability, their creativity, their worth. But externally, they are constantly hitting invisible walls.
Informal networks.
Yeah. They are left out of the informal networking groups, the study circles, the referral networks for tech jobs in places like Silicon Valley, where caste dynamics have actually recently been exposed in major corporate lawsuits.
Right. It traveled with the diaspora.
The core feeling is, I have infinitely more to offer than this legacy system allows me to become. The system still tries to lock their identity at birth and define their worth externally.
But the modern ecosystem is fighting exactly that, with unprecedented sophistication. The sources outline an incredible, multi-layered network of reclamation. You have advocacy groups like the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, fighting for legal enforcement and documenting atrocities.
Building a case on the ground.
Yes. You have empowerment organizations building grassroots leadership and economic independence.
And crucial to this is the political layer. Movements like the Bahujan Samaj Party, founded by Kanshi Ram and later led by MOAT. This was a seismic shift.
A huge change in strategy.
They moved the strategy from just advocating for basic rights from the dominant groups to actively acquiring political power and state machinery for themselves.
Furthermore, you have global movements. Organizations like the International Dalit Solidarity Network are successfully reframing caste not as a localized internal tradition, but as a global human rights issue, bringing it to the United Nations and international courts.
What I find most powerful in all of this is the profound irony of the word Dalit itself.
It is a masterclass in linguistic reclamation.
It really is.
A word that originally meant broken, crushed, or scattered, an imposed label of deep limitation has been entirely repurposed. It is now a unified political force. It is a source of fierce pride, a banner of solidarity, and a tool for collective agency.
It's amazing.
The very concept of a marginalized identity, used to define them from the outside, is being weaponized to dismantle the system from the inside.
And for you listening, this deep dive completely shatters one of the most pervasive myths of the modern world, the
Yeah.
myth of a pure meritocracy.
Absolutely shatters it.
The historical data proves, undeniably, that when access to education, capital, and networks increases, performance gaps between groups shrink dramatically. The 3,000-year historical system didn't reflect a lack of natural ability in marginalized groups. It was a mechanism designed to actively, intentionally filter out opportunity to protect the mediocre comfort of those at the top.
It demonstrates conclusively that stereotypes of incapability are not reflections of reality. They are tools constructed to serve specific social and economic functions.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull back and look at the massive journey we've just taken. We started 3,000 years ago, watching how a simple, functional division of labor, who handles the waste, who handles the dead, slowly, insidiously morphed into a biological bias.
Step by step.
We saw that bias evolve into a religious belief in impurity, which hardened into physical structures of segregation and restricted marriage, which ultimately normalized into a multi-millennia legacy of oppression. We've learned that profound prejudice isn't just about blind, irrational hatred. It is a highly functional architectural system organizing fear, labor, and power.
And while the context today was the specific, deeply complex historical reality of the Dalit experience, the psychological ingredients we uncovered are universally human.
They are everywhere.
The weaponization of disgust, the conformity of the fearful follower, the status anxiety of the middle manager, the desire for social order, the desperate rationalization of inequality. These are traits that can be and are plugged into institutions and societies all over the world today.
Which brings us back to where we started. We've spent this time looking at the perfectly engineered systems of human inequality. We've seen how an ancient society convinced itself that a system of crushing, permanent inequality was just the natural order of things, simply because it subsidized their comfort and made their own lives easier.
It's a sobering realization.
It is. So I want to leave you with a question to mull over as you go about your day. Look around at our modern, highly globalized world today. Look at your supply chains, your tech devices, your city streets. Who is doing the invisible, undesirable, or dangerous labor that makes your daily convenience possible? Wait, let me rephrase that without trailing off. Who is doing the invisible labor that makes your daily convenience possible, and what stories has our society quietly invented to justify keeping them exactly where they are?
A vital, uncomfortable question for all of us to sit with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible structures around you. Keep looking past the surface of the stories we are told, and we will catch you next time.